There are women who lose their marriages in dramatic moments. A text found, a door slammed, a name said wrong in sleep. I lost mine on a dance floor at someone else's wedding, in front of 40 people, and I was the one holding the microphone. I have spent a long time telling myself the story of a woman who needed air, who needed to feel like herself again, who was fighting against the slow erasure of 5 years of a man who loved her too efficiently to ever ask her what she wanted. That story had a real core to it. What I cannot explain, even now, is how I turned a real complaint into a public performance and then watched the man I accused of controlling me walk out of the room with everything. The home, the evidence, the quiet knowledge that he had been the only person in that ballroom who actually knew my name. My name is Petra Marsh. I am 31 years old, and I make my living as a freelance event photographer, spending weekends in rented ballrooms watching other people step into the best moments of their lives. I am good at this because I know how to disappear inside a room, how to press the shutter in the half-second before a person remembers they are being photographed. The frames I keep are the ones nobody planned for. My husband Connell is 34, an operations director for a mid-sized logistics firm, and the kind of man who memorizes every preference you have ever mentioned and builds a quiet system around supplying it before you have to ask. On a Sunday morning in October, he brought me tea before I had spoken a word. The right mug, the right temperature, the exact amount of milk, all without coordination. I stood at the kitchen window and tried to decide whether what I was holding was warmth or something I did not yet have a name for. We used to trade newspaper sections in bed on Sunday mornings. Connell switched us to tablets 18 months earlier for efficiency, and I adapted. And somewhere in that adaptation, we stopped being in the same room for that particular quiet. That morning, I worked through 200 frames from a Saturday wedding in my photography studio, the second bedroom, the one room that still ran by my own logic. I kept 37, the ones where nobody knew the shutter was already moving. At noon, he mentioned he had already RSVP'd for both of us to a colleague's dinner on Thursday. He asked afterward whether that suited me, and then, after a pause, whether she had been feeling all right lately, whether things between them were good. I said Thursday was fine, and that everything was fine. The sequence, the decision before the question, added itself to a list I had been keeping without a title. That afternoon, Sasha called about the Saturday wedding. Midway through the logistics, she asked how I was actually doing, and I paused before answering. That evening, reaching into the freezer, I knocked the photo booth strip from the refrigerator door. 4 frames from year 1. Me laughing, Connell watching my face with an expression I did not remember capturing. He came into the kitchen while I was still holding it, said he remembered that night, and asked whether she thought they still made time for moments like that one. I said I did too, which answered only the first part. He pressed the strip back under the magnet. Later, in bed, he took my hand in the dark. On Tuesday afternoon, I drove to Dario's studio, officially to look at a visual concept he had mentioned for a possible joint client pitch. Dario Reyes has been Connell's closest friend since their second year at university. He runs a graphic design practice on the 3rd floor of a building in the east of the city, and the studio smells like pour-over coffee and paper, and the particular disorder of a person who works by instinct and needs no architecture. There are drafting tables covered in print references, a postcard from somewhere cold pinned above the monitor, and a stack of typography books that doubles as a surface for whatever mug is currently in rotation. He made coffee while I looked at his reference wall, and then he asked what I had been working on. Not what projects were on the calendar, not what upcoming shoots I had, but what I had been working on, which assumed I was developing something of my own, something with no client brief attached, and no delivery date. I was not ready for a question in that shape. I told him about the landscape series I had been planning privately for months. 12 locations, each photographed at 12 consecutive hours of the day, from earliest light to late dark, no assignment, no expected output, just the documentation of how a place changes when no one has arranged anything in it. Nobody knew about this project. Dario pulled out a sketch pad without comment and made quick compositional sketches while I described the first 3 locations. And when I finished, he said it sounded like the kind of work that showed what a person actually saw rather than what they were paid to look at. I drove home 2.5 hours later with that word, showed, sitting somewhere in my chest where it had no professional category to belong to. That evening, Connell walked me through something he had done to the shared home laptop. He had reorganized my editing software, the toolbar, the folder architecture, the export sequence, because the workflow I had been using contained unnecessary steps, and he had found a cleaner route. His explanation was precise and his intentions were good, and every change was, by any external measurement, better than what it replaced. I closed the laptop without opening a single folder. He asked from the doorway whether the groupings made sense or whether I would prefer the layout restored to what it had been, and he said he had made the client archive searchable by month and by project type, and that he wanted her workspace to feel like her own and not something imposed. He said to tell him if anything was wrong and he would fix it immediately. I said it looked good. I went to the kitchen and stood at the counter until the kettle boiled, and I did not open the laptop again that night. Thursday morning, Connell found Tuesday's call to Dario in the shared phone plan invoice, 41 minutes, logged at 2:14 in the afternoon. He brought it up at breakfast without accusation, placing it in the conversation the way he placed any data point that required an account. He asked whether Dario was doing all right, because 41 minutes seemed long for a pitch discussion, and he wanted to know, as a close friend, whether anything was going on that he should be aware of. He named the call log entry specifically, the contact, the duration, the afternoon timestamp. He added that if the collaboration with Dario's clients was something I wanted to develop, he was glad to sit with the budget together. He said then that he was asking about Dario, but also asking about her, whether she was all right, whether there was something on her mind he had been missing. I told him the call had been about a project possibility with one of Dario's contacts, and that they had covered a lot of ground. I said there was nothing to be concerned about on Dario's end. I said it in the register I had developed for closing a topic cleanly, and he accepted it without pressing, and the acceptance confirmed something I was still not addressing by name. I drove to a shoot that afternoon and rehearsed, for 11 minutes on the road, the version of the conversation I had not had. The one where I explained that being anticipated was not the same as being known, that having every preference supplied before I voiced it was not the same as being asked to have preferences, that I had been living inside a well-managed life for 4 years and had started to feel like a component of it rather than a person alongside it. I rehearsed it clearly enough to believe I could say it someday. I parked, put on the camera strap, and went into the venue. On Thursday afternoon, Sasha was collecting a coffee order from Brewpoint when she saw me through the front window at the corner table with Dario. The order was not ready, and she waited at the counter for close to 2 minutes. She told me later that what she observed was 2 people having a conversation at a cafe table, and she could not name anything as a problem. What she also observed, and what she logged in a note she opened on her phone that evening, was the specific quality of my posture. Leaning forward, talking quickly, animated in a way that had nothing to do with deliverables. She had sat exactly that way, at a different cafe table, in the months before her own marriage ended. She texted me to say I had looked good at Brewpoint. I replied with a flame emoji and let the thread close. That evening, Connell came to the doorway of my photography studio. He said he wanted to go through the Thursday dinner details while there was still time to adjust anything if needed, since he had put the reservation on the shared calendar and wanted to make sure she was actually on board and not just going along with something he had organised without asking. He named the restaurant, the time, the colleague who had extended the invitation. He said he wanted her to want to be there, not to feel arranged into it, and he asked whether the dinner was something she was genuinely comfortable with. I said the timing was fine. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than the answer required, and when I did not look up from the screen, he said goodnight and went to bed. I sat in the studio for another hour without working on anything. The landscape series folder was on the desktop, closed and still without a proper name. Saturday morning I found the camera bag by the front door with all the lenses capped and the humidity seal closed. He had checked the weather forecast and done it before I was awake. I picked up the bag, stood in the hallway for a moment and went out to the car. The Whitmore Hotel ballroom had maple floors and wood panel walls and round tables set with glass votives, and by the time the dancing started, the bass from the DJ booth at the far end came through the soles of every shoe on the floor. Levi and Genevieve's wedding was 40 guests in a room built for intimacy rather than spectacle, and I had drunk 2 glasses of wine by the toasts and was standing near the edge of the dance floor in a dress I had not worn since a different year of my life. Dario materialized beside me when a group song came on and pulled me into the middle of things with the easy, unthinking energy that was entirely and specifically Dario, the energy of a person who does not understand the weight of a room because he has never needed to. By the second song, the group had spread out, and it was primarily the two of us, and the space between us had narrowed in a way that several people at the surrounding tables could read without difficulty. His hands moved to my waist. I registered the movement with full clarity. I did not redirect his hands. This is the fact I have not found a way to file differently no matter how many times I have returned to it. I registered where his hands were, and I left them there, and the reason I left them was not carelessness. I was aware of the tables ringing the floor. I was aware of Sasha somewhere in the room with the phone she had been using all evening for the couple's footage. I was aware of 40 witnesses, and I thought, standing in the low bass with his hands on my waist, that a woman who is only dancing cannot be accused of anything. Connell came back from the bar with 2 drinks. He stood at the edge of the floor for the length of a long breath, and his face did not show what I expected it to show. There was no heat in it, no dramatic reaction. It had the quality of a man arriving at the end of a calculation he had already been running for some time. He walked onto the floor. He placed one hand on Dario's shoulder and said something at a volume that reached no one else. Dario stepped back immediately because Dario was not combative and had not understood until that moment the specific shape of what he had been standing inside. He moved toward the bar without looking at me, and the 4-second transaction was calm and entirely complete. Then I spoke. I spoke before I had assessed the room, because the alternative was absorbing what Connell's expression looked like from close range, and I was not prepared to do that. I told him he was ruining everything. I told him I had been just dancing and that he could not allow me one single night. I said it at a volume that carried clearly to the 3 nearest tables, and what I produced for the room was a specific image. A man who could not permit his wife to exist outside his management of her. This was the image I needed the room to hold. I was also completely aware, in the same moment I produced it, that it was the most dishonest thing I had said in my entire marriage, because I knew precisely what those hands on my waist had been, and I had just described it as ordinary movement. Connell set both drinks on the nearest table surface. He asked me, quietly and with one specific detail. He said he had caught the expression on my face in the moment before Dario's hands moved, and named it, and said that what he had seen did not match the word nothing, to step away from the floor with him so they could speak privately. He said 2 drinks sitting on a table in front of everyone they knew was not where he wanted to have this conversation, and that he was not asking for an argument, only for 5 minutes away from the speakers. I told him again, at the same volume, that I had been dancing and there was nothing to discuss, and that his reaction was embarrassing both of them in front of people who mattered. He looked at me for 2 seconds. He said they should talk when I was ready, and then he walked off the floor and sat down at a table near the east wall and began speaking to Genevieve's uncle about something completely unrelated to what had just happened. He did not look at the dance floor again. I went back to the floor for one more song in the general group with people who had no connection to what had just passed. Dario stayed at the bar. The room continued to be a wedding. I told myself for the first time of many that I had handled things correctly. Earlier, moving through the hotel corridor toward the entrance, I had passed the photo booth the couple had set up, the same model as the booth from year one, the strip on my refrigerator at home. I stopped for 1 second. String lights spelled out Levi and Genevieve in white. I kept walking. After the dance floor, I went through a staff door into the catering prep corridor, fluorescent tube lighting overhead, stainless steel surfaces on both sides, the smell of warming trays and dish soap. I stood with my back against the cold metal wall while the bass from the other side came through thin. And then the DJ shifted to something slower, and the opening bars reached me through the plaster, and I recognized them because it was the last song from our own wedding reception 4 years ago, the one that played when the lights came halfway up, and Connell had his arms around me, and we were both tired in the specific way of people who have been happy for several hours and do not want the evening to end. For 4 seconds, I was not performing anything for anyone. Then the next track began, and the bass returned, and I pushed off the wall and went back inside. In the parking lot at 11:15, the amber safety lamps cast everything in orange. Connell sat alone in the car for 3 minutes before I crossed the asphalt toward him. He opened his phone, found Sasha's contact, added a brief note with the date, and saved the record. He started the engine the moment my hand reached the door handle. The drive home was wordless. He played nothing on the stereo. At the third traffic light, I opened my phone and found a notification. A tag in a story posted by one of Levi's cousins, captioned with dancing emojis. 9 seconds of video. My face, my words, his stillness, the 2 drinks placed on the table. 43 views already, and one of the account names in the viewer list was Maran's. On Sunday morning, 3 days after the wedding, I passed the Home Office with the door slightly open and found Connell in the desk chair with both hands flat on his knees and his eyes on the wall above the monitor. He was not at the computer. He was not on his phone. There was a mug of coffee on the desk beside the closed laptop, and it had been there long enough to go cold, made and then abandoned while whatever was happening inside him had his full attention. There was nothing strategic in the image, no call in progress, no records being organized, nothing being built. He was simply a man who had been carrying something for 3 days and had set it down for one private moment in a room he thought was empty. I stood in the doorway for 2 seconds and then went to the kitchen and made breakfast. I told myself he was sulking about Saturday, which was the only explanation that required nothing from me. On Monday morning, I came to the kitchen before he left and told him I had been thinking and that I believed we needed real time together. Not the shared calendar kind, but something deliberate. I named a restaurant we both liked and proposed Friday at 7. I was warm and I was specific, and I meant perhaps half of what I was offering. The other half was the management of a timeline, because a good Friday dinner would make the wedding video older news by the time any direct conversation about it became unavoidable. Connell said yes. He then asked gently whether they could use the dinner to talk through Saturday, or whether she needed the evening to be lighter than that. I said I would prefer one night without an agenda first, and that if they could just be good together, the rest might be easier to approach. He said he understood, and he added the dinner to the shared calendar. I did not add it to mine. On Tuesday evening, Maren had us for dinner at her house in the northern suburbs. The kitchen had a long wooden table and a pasta pot on the full back burner and a wall of framed family photographs along one side. Connell at 12 with a handsaw, Maren at 20 beside a dog, both of them at a summer reunion that predated me entirely. After dinner, while Connell was on the back porch with a neighbour who had appeared over the fence, I helped Maren clear the plates. She washed and I dried, and she said nothing about the wedding for a long time, while the pasta water drained and the kitchen filled with steam. Then she said, looking at the basin rather than at me, that she had known her brother for 34 years, and that the man who sat down at the edge of the dance floor on Saturday and talked to Genevieve's uncle about renovation work for 40 minutes was not performing calm. She said he was a man who had already made a decision privately that he had not yet told anyone. She said she was not telling me what to do. She was telling me what she saw. Then she handed me the pasta pot and returned to the stove, and that was the full content of the conversation, and it was the most precise thing anyone said to me across the entire arc of what followed. Driving home, I kept returning to had already made a decision. I could not verify it and I could not counter it, and both of those absences were their own kind of data. I drove with the radio off and watched the streetlights change and thought about the way Maren had handed me the pot, the particular neutrality of that gesture, the way it contained no invitation to argue. And by the time we reached our building, I had talked myself back into the position that she had simply said the wrong thing about her brother, as siblings sometimes do when they are protective. I went upstairs. I did not revisit the thought until I was already in bed, when I found I could not stop. On Friday, we went to the restaurant I had proposed. The lighting was warm and the food was good, and I ordered a second glass of wine, and the dinner was, on its surface, pleasant. He tried once during the main course. He mentioned that Sasha had called to check in and found it kind of her, and he said it in a tone that gave me a clear opening to say something about the wedding, about Sasha, about what Sasha might have seen and what she might have decided to do with it. He asked whether there was anything I wanted to tell him before things became harder to manage on both sides. I reached for the bread. He did not push. He paid the bill. On the drive home, I told myself I had navigated the evening successfully. He had confirmed something he had been fairly certain of since Tuesday. The following morning, Connell sent Sasha a message. He attached the 9-second clip, which he had downloaded before the cousin deleted the story. His message asked, in one sentence, whether she had seen anything at the reception that she would be willing to tell him about, in her own time, with no pressure. Sasha was alone in her apartment when the message arrived. She watched the clip 4 times. She opened the note on her phone, the one she had started after Brewpoint, and read through it. Then she wrote back that yes, she had things she wanted to say, and asked whether written would be better than a call. He replied, "Written, please." She began composing. Wednesday evening, I reached for my keys from the hook by the front door, and the hook looked wrong. His key slot was empty. The pale rectangle on the wall behind it, where the paint was slightly different, where 4 years of a key's absence had interrupted the light slightly differently than the surrounding wall, was unmistakable once I was looking at it. I told myself he had needed the key for something. I did not ask him about it. Thursday morning, in the home office looking for a USB cable, I opened the wrong drawer and found a manila folder labelled in Connell's handwriting with a date 4 days after the wedding. Inside, a still frame from the 9-second video and a printed copy of the first 2 pages of a text exchange between Sasha and Connell. I read the opening line of Sasha's first long message. Then I closed the folder exactly as I had found it, located the cable, went to my photography studio, and sat at the desk for a long time without opening anything. On Thursday afternoon, I drove to Dario's studio. I had no appointment and no professional pretext. The folder in the desk drawer had been behind my eyes since morning, and the apartment had begun to feel like a room where evidence was accumulating just below a surface I could not reach. Dario was at his drafting table and was clearly not expecting me, and also genuinely glad that I was there, because that was what Dario was, glad when someone he liked appeared without notice. I told him, not in detail but in outline, that the marriage was in serious trouble, that Connell had been keeping records, that she had spent years making herself smaller inside a well-managed life without understanding that was what she was doing. Dario asked whether I was all right. I said I was, actually for the first time in a while. I stayed 3 hours. We talked through the landscape series. He pulled out the sketch pad with the compositional sketches from the previous Tuesday, and we went through all 12 locations by season and by light. And the afternoon had the specific relief of being asked rather than anticipated. At 5:30, my phone showed a message from Connell asking about dinner. I typed, "Out with a client, home by 7." I read the message back once and sent it. This was the first time in our marriage that I said something that was not technically true. The distinction between an omission and a fabrication was one I had maintained carefully for months, and I crossed it deliberately, with full awareness of the crossing. At 5:47, Sasha was walking past Dario's building when she saw my car in the parking bay. She stopped, photographed the license plate with the timestamp visible in the frame, added 2 sentences to the note, and continued to her appointment. I arrived home at 6:18. Connell was already there and the kitchen smelled like a pasta sauce that takes 40 minutes, which meant he had come home early. My camera bag was by the front door. He mentioned the afternoon rain had been heavier than predicted, and that he had capped the lenses. He said he had rearranged his 4 o'clock meeting to be home and wanted to know which client the afternoon had been with and whether she preferred him home in evenings or needed the apartment to herself. He referenced the camera bag, the capped lenses, and asked whether she wanted to tell him anything about the afternoon. I named a client. The name was real. The connection to Thursday was not. Connell received it without reacting. Then he said something in a different register from the first question. He said he needed to know whether they were still being honest with each other about where they were, because if they were not, he would prefer to know directly rather than to find it out another way. He pointed to the key hook by the front door, the empty slot where his key had been, which he named as a deliberate choice, not an oversight, and said the choice had been about needing to understand what he was dealing with, and that he needed her to tell him what she was dealing with too. Then he said something I had not expected him to say. He named the moving survey from 14 months ago. He had not mentioned it since the day I found the confirmation email. He said he had filled in the household preferences form without asking her, that he had been certain he already knew everything she would want, and that he had thought about that decision many times since and understood it was not the same as asking. He said he had been wrong about that. He asked whether she had needed to say that to him for a long time, and then he said, "Tell me what you want." He said he would like to start asking. I stood at the counter and looked at him, and told him that one admission about a moving survey, produced at this table after 5 years of a marriage built around his anticipations, was not repair, it was inventory. I said he had spent the entire length of our marriage treating our shared life as a project he managed, and now that the project showed a deficiency, he had produced a corrective action, and that I was not a deliverable on a timeline. I said the fact that he was only saying this tonight, at this table with dinner on the stove, with my camera bag attended to before I arrived, proved that he understood what had gone wrong but operated entirely in the language of maintenance, and that maintenance was not the same as love. I told him I had needed him to ask what I wanted for years, and that tonight was too late. I said I had been disappearing inside this apartment for the better part of 2 years and could not keep doing it. Almost everything I said had a real core. That was what made it the most destructive thing in the room. I walked past the camera bag and past him, took my keys from the hook, and went for a walk. I was gone for 2 hours. When I came back, the pasta sauce was covered, and in the refrigerator and the kitchen was clean. The home office light showed under the door. I stopped outside it and the door opened and Connell said, in the same even register he had used throughout everything that week, that he was going to handle things properly from this point and that I would hear from someone by the end of the week. He asked whether I had somewhere I could be for a few days if that became necessary. I said I did not understand what he meant. He said it might be useful to have a plan ready. He closed the door. I stood in the apartment hallway and understood, arriving at it without language, that the liberation I had been performing for 8 months was not something I actually felt. There was no version of the dance floor, or the studio afternoons, or the conversation I had just delivered at the kitchen counter that had moved me anywhere I wanted to go. I went to the kitchen and looked at the photo booth strip on the refrigerator door and then turned off the light and went to bed. Friday morning, Connell left before I woke. On the kitchen counter, the building management number, the utilities account reference, the name of a family law consultant, and below them, In the same handwriting, one sentence, that he should have asked her more. I photographed the note with my phone, not to send anywhere, just to have it. Sunday afternoon, a delivery notification arrived. Tuesday at 2 p.m. Sender listed as an administrative office. I closed the screen and went to stand at the kitchen window. The photo booth strip was in my peripheral vision, and I did not look at it. On Tuesday at 2 p.m., there was a knock at the front door. A building management liaison and a woman in a navy blazer stood at the threshold. The woman confirmed my legal name, noted the time on a form, and handed me a sealed envelope. Inside, a court order granting Connell exclusive right to the marital home, effective 21 days from service, with a move-out deadline and a first hearing 14 days ahead. Also attached, an evidence schedule, the 9-second video with its original timestamp, Sasha's written statement 4 pages, dated the Thursday after the wedding, the Brew Point sighting with date and time, a parking camera timestamp placing my car below Dario's building from 5:47 to 6:09 p.m. that Thursday, and the 5:30 p.m. text I sent Connell that afternoon. Out with a client, printed beside the parking record's contradiction. The building liaison noted the date. The apartment door was still open behind me. Through the gap, the photo booth strip was on the refrigerator. The woman in the navy blazer did not make eye contact. I called Renata that evening. I told her the story in the frame I had been carrying, a legal process triggered by 9 seconds of video and a misread text. She said she had seen the video, that it showed me telling my husband he was ruining everything in front of 40 people and that she was not going to tell me his response was an overreaction. She said she loved me. She said goodbye. What I had believed gave me power was the dance floor, the witnesses, the words, the image of a woman who could not be managed. What Connell had built quietly from the material I kept giving him was a 4-page written statement, a time-stamped parking record, and a note on the kitchen counter that said he should have asked more. He was the only person in any room who had been paying that specific kind of attention to the shape of my life, and I had stood in front of 40 witnesses and called it the problem. Closure snapshot. The spare room in Sasha's apartment faces east, and the light is wrong in the mornings. The camera bag has been on the floor for 11 days. The joint credit line is suspended and the utility figures do not balance. Dario's profile went private 8 days ago. Levi and Genevieve have not reached out. One woman I counted as a friend sent a message and did not follow it. The photo booth strip is still on the refrigerator in the apartment I have 21 days to vacate. I am the one who is not there.